Great. Well, welcome everybody to our event today, a fireside chat with Karime Hassan, Chief Executive and Growth Director at Exeter City Council. This event is hosted by the Exeter MBA as part of our Leading Edge series. And we're also delighted that today's event also forms part of the university's Festival of Discovery, which starts today and runs over the next 2 weeks, giving students a whole range of opportunities, both on campus and online, to find out more about the university and the local community. So welcome if you're joining us as part of the Festival of Discovery. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Ciara Eastell and I'm a Professor of Practice at the Centre for Leadership here in the Business School. And as many of you may know from previous Leading Edge events, I'm delighted to have curated and host this Leading Edge series. And through this series of fireside chats, we aim to give you, as MBA students, as alumni, as our local business community and stakeholders, just the opportunity to hear very informally the personal leadership stories of a diverse range of leaders from across business and civil society. Now, the aim is for a very informal discussion, so hopefully you've all got your sandwiches and your cups of tea to sit and listen to our conversation with Karime. We're going to talk for about half an hour and then we'll open it up for your questions, but do feel free to put your questions in the chat as we go along. So welcome, Karime, to this Leading Edge fireside chat. Karime is, as I say, the Chief Executive and Growth Director at Exeter City Council, a role he took up in 2013. He's a chartered town planner by background and has worked on some of the most significant developments in Exeter and Devon during this time, including the development of Princess Hay, the Met Office and the Science Park. I think I've known Karime for probably getting on for 10 years, I think. And I've always been struck by how passionate he's always been about all aspects of Exeter and how supportive he's been of colleagues working across the city to make Exeter a vibrant, engaging place to live and work. So welcome, Karime. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. And we're looking forward to hearing all about your leadership journey over the past 35 years. So perhaps I can kick off, Karime, and just ask you a bit about your job. So you're CEO and Growth Director at Exeter City Council. Can you just tell us a bit about what your job involves?
So everybody would probably understand what a CEO is, a chief executive is for an organization. And in business, you're in charge of the staffing and obviously the direction of an organization. I think probably the public sector has a different dimension to those who are familiar with private sector businesses. And I think it relates to the role that we play as an organization relative to place. So I would say part of my job and the purpose of my job is just not to be the head of the page service, to run the organization for the city council, but also is the role I play in relation to the location and place. And my role I see as how do I enhance Exeter? How do I make the city a stronger city? Which inevitably then requires me to think about the kind of challenges that all the organizations in the city face. So in your case, when you are running the library, it's a key element of our cultural offer. Because my role is about making the city stronger, if I can support the institutions to be basically stronger, I'm fulfilling my job. So I see that kind of growth-orientated role about that, really, supporting the city.
And what does a typical day, sort of maybe tell us pre-pandemic and pandemic, but what does a typical day in the life of a chief exec of a city council like Exeter look like, Karime?
It's really difficult because every day is varied, but a lot of my time is spent probably how I'm helping others, which, so my kind of typical day would be a conversation that might start from the college. The college might say, typically, we've got this opportunity, but we need the council to play a part, and it might be a land transaction, or it may be something about a pitch they need to make to government about a skills agenda, and they just need the support of the council. Or it might be a business, and a business wants to make a decision. Quite often, it could be a very quick decision they need, but they want some confidence. So you might take an organization, let's take the Ivy, due to open up now in the city. So if you're a business like that, they will probably have concerns about the planning implications, listed building consent type issues, but probably more than anything about skills. Can they get the right workforce in place? And that's a kind of typical conversation for businesses in the city. Now, on top of that, I'm in crisis world all the time. What I mean by that is you can imagine your services, day-to-day services will have issues. You'll have issues like when we had the unexploded bomb device. Yeah, those are the kind of things. So you can't really legislate for that. They just happen. So you've got to be available really all times to be able to step into those kind of occasions.
And can you tell us a bit about what it's been like to be a leader in the city over this past 12 months, Karime? How's it been for you and your team to be leading at this particular moment in time?
So the short answer has been really difficult, very challenging. But you asked me about, so your role, give me an insight of your role. And I'll explain how my role has shaped the way we responded. And it's the kind of thing you need to do as a leader. So the 12 months before COVID, I took a decision that we would need to go agile and flexible in the way we design work. Basically, I wanted everything to be able to be done digitally, and that you should be able, with a phone, to access all your services. And so prior to COVID, we basically come out of one of the tower blocks in our, if the city council has 2 tower blocks. We took a decision, we'll come out of one, save financially because we ought to let out those spaces, but most importantly, the whole organization would be equipped that every member of staff should be able to work from anywhere. And so that was pretty important to be able to, when COVID hit, for us to be able to work from home. And if we hadn't made that call, we might have had a difficulty. The second element prior to COVID is we took a view we needed to invest very heavily in community infrastructure to create a real sense of well-being within the city. And through the kind of asset-based community development approach that Cormac Russell advocates, we had put a big investment in community infrastructure. And so when COVID hit, we could pivot that work into supporting the vulnerable and providing food for individuals. So big strategic calls that we had to make before COVID, and that put us in a better position when COVID hit. Because we did that, I was able to manage staff through home, and all my managers virtually overnight work from home. I would say one thing, right, because it's a good leadership issue. This is really important. Because naturally you think you need to be seen, and I thought, oh, I might need to be in the office. One of the leading lights in the local government world, a chap called Chris, he runs Barking and Dagenham, I've got his name now. He put out a tweet that night about he was working from home, but he basically said, if I can't do it, who else will? And I thought, he's absolutely right. If I don't make that decision to work from home, how will others do it? So it was a good call because the whole organization went 80% of the staff working from home. So quite a different working arrangement. And you lose your network, you know, that sense of who you're in contact with, and that's quite a challenge.
I talked to you quite early on in the pandemic, I think about 5 weeks in, and you were reflecting on how strange it was to be at home with your daughters and your family, and not being in the city centre. How have you coped? You're the kind of person that's out in the city, you're having your lunch in Pret, you're kind of meeting people. How has it been to be at home with your family so much?
So on a human level, brilliant, right? And I kind of, look, I'll be honest, when we went agile and flexible, it was a big call on my part that I had to make, and partly informed by my experience. And I, at times you do need to think about, well, okay, it's easy for me. I got nice accommodation. But what if you're in a kitchen unit, where you've got a small flat, and how you're going to work, and those kind of personal things, you need to think about that. But what I learned is, one, yeah, it can be a very different place to work, which can be great in one sense, but actually for me, losing touch with what's going on in the high street, what's going on with business is a real problem. So I've had to deliberately, when I can, take the opportunity to go and have a look what's going on in the city. So I've had to compensate. But yeah, it has been a good learning experience. We accelerated the pace with which we made changes, which were, I think, unthinkable 18 months ago.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to take you back now. That was a bit about kind of what's going on now, but I'm going to take you right back to the beginning of before the beginning of your career, Karime. Can you just tell us a bit about kind of your early life, and what your, as a child, as a teenager, what your sort of career aspirations were?
Okay. So what you need to know about me is I'm from Cardiff, Docklands, and people call it Tiger Bay. So it's a multi-ethnic community, one of the oldest in the country. My grandfather came from Yemen, 1938. And in those days, if white women married black men or brown men, as the case, it was really tough. We had our race riots in Cardiff Bay in 1919. And those memories were very strong amongst my auntie, great auntie. And that, I think, there was a real challenge there, because in our educational system, I think we were often let down. There was no, I'll give a real little example. Primary school, I was a bright kid in primary school. All the Docks kids, when we went to the secondary school, my secondary school was Willows High, no one had a report. So we all went into the remedials. So you got to think, you're 11-year-old. I remember crying my eyes out walking from remedial class, thinking, because they had a list of the classes, you had all the numbers, the remedials at the bottom. And I remember thinking, so you feel you're at the bottom, isn't it? And so I had to work my way to the top with very little kind of, anyway, the bottom line is, look, educational system quite often, particularly for young black people, often let them down. And an example of that, when I was 16 and I decided to stay on sixth form, there was only a handful of kids. And I started to study, I started to get a sense of a career, and I wanted to go to university. And my maths teacher, his name now, never forgot it, Mr. Howells. He was my form tutor. He said, Karime, you save your £2.50, which is the UCA, I think is the UCA university clearance. You will never get in, save your £2.50. Now, thank God, I had enough about me to say, I'm going to give it a go. I've gone to university. Otherwise, like a lot of my working class kids, that would have been the end of their career. So that was you're fighting against a structural issue. But probably the most profound thing for me was I went to university and then mixed with kids who had been to private school. So I had to learn what homework was, proper organized homework. Because you got to remember, my parents' generation never expected anyone to go to university. They would say, go and be a fitter, a welder or something, get a trade. So when I was at first year in university, end of year, I had my review, and my form tutor said, you did really well, Karime. You came top of the class, and if you carry on like this, you'll get a first. You might be a chief executive, not chief executive, chief planner or director. So that was the first time anyone said to me, you could aspire to be someone like a director or something. And I thereafter applied myself very differently. And I've remembered that because I've done a lot of work with kids in tough areas to kind of look at their aspirations, how they might be good and get better. Yeah. So it's an issue. I'm lots of working class because look, the kids I went to school with, they were talented, better than me. They never went on further education. So it's a tragedy, the amount of talent.
And so it's an extraordinary story in terms of that, and that one person just saying you could be a chief planner. That's so fascinating. So you were studying town planning then at Nottingham. You were at Trent.
Yes, so I went to Trent Poly. We did town planning. And when Margaret Thatcher was in charge, there was lots of unemployment. Everybody was desperate to get a graduate place, And I was really lucky because at that time I got married in my final year and a child on the way. And then an opportunity came up in Derby, and it was something targeted for ethnic minority kids, which is another thing I'm really grateful for. It was something called a Section 11 appointment, which meant the council would pay 50% of the salary, and then the Home Office or Department of Environment would pay the other 50%. And because it was encouraging ethnic minorities, I got into a council as a community liaison officer. So I started my career as a community liaison officer, working between the different ethnic minority communities. And then someone in the department took a shine to me and then started to give me some constructive help, which was really good because I was a trade unionist then and I was quite radical. And he said, look, sometimes you need someone to give you a bit of help, give me a bit of constructive help. So that was really helpful. And I flourished and then got into planning, and that was quite helpful. And then obviously management is a very different story then, from professional planner But the one thing I would say, Ciara, is I took a master's degree in public-private, so it's basically an industrial and public planning policy, which meant I did a master's, and it was a small number of people, but they were directors and chief officers. And I was only a young person, probably 23, 24 at the time. And what I learned from them was something that stood me the whole of my career, which is an ability to work with the private sector to try and understand what they needed to be successful. And it kind of made me a bit different than most planners. I'm not just a process person. I've always taken an interest. What do we need to support you, and how we deal with these structural challenges that industry tends to have? Yeah.
And do you, I mean, where there's this really such a strong sense of ambition, Karime, in you, and, you know, to come from Tiger Bay, you know, no expectations on you, and then to be where you are now. And you talked about that person that kind of said, you've got talent, you can do something. But where does that spirit of ambition come from, and how do you think that kind of sense of ambition we can build in young people today?
So my grandfather was a very special man. He was the leader of the Sufis in this country, right? I don't know if you know Sufis, but he had a real strong character, which helped form. So, you know, I would get up at 5 a.m. before the sunrise, and I'd have to go to his house, and I would be there, and he would be just giving me something of a spiritual insight, which helped. And it's quite noticeable. My cousin, who was with me, same age, he's a multi-millionaire innovator lives in Northern Ireland, right? Makes sensors when you drill for oil, you make drill bits, multi-millionaire. So there must have been something from the character. And that's one thing I would say here. You know, when you talk about leadership, we talk about effective management and there's leadership, but there's something about the person as well. That's about character, which you work on all your life, don't you, to get better. But what I used to do, I used to go to places like Cardiff, Tiger Bay, but also some bigger urban areas to work with the Afro-Caribbean community or the Asian community. I used to teach karate to them. And as part of teaching karate, I would try to give them something about education. And started off with, I would give them newspapers to read, you know, so they'd be 15, 16-year-olds. I tell them to read a broadsheet newspaper, understand what was going on, current affairs, but equally, really, especially about Afro-Caribbean, a lot of my mates, Afro-Caribbean kids, who didn't have that career paths clearly set out to them, how they could be. And I'll give you two examples, right? So one boy called Mahbub, he was a taxi driver, and Mansour is a butcher. Both of them are doctors now, right? They're doctors. And it was that ability to say, you could do that. And they work really hard, and they become role models for their own community, you know? So that's something really matters to me. And the other element, I do the job I do because as a kid, when you see the kind of things you see in some of these tough neighborhoods, and how, you know, I remember my mother was on benefits when I was about 10, it would have been about 9, 10. We'd go to ask social services for support, and they'd have a look in their eye, which was usually when we were begging for food. It'd be like a Wednesday afternoon. You go to the market, you get cheap food on Wednesday afternoon because that's the market, you'll get cheap food. But, you know, there's a sense in which the public servants can either look at you as a human with needs that we're going to try and help and give you dignity, or they look at you as officious bureaucrats, look down at you, and you feel not very good. And so I've always felt, it's a passion of mine, that, you know, you need to deal with the human being and help them access the kind of services that is their right. And also for our youngsters, to find ways to improve. And that's, for me, is what the beauty of the job is. It's you can literally change people's life opportunities by choosing which meetings you take. Yeah. So the fact that somebody picks up the phone to me, so I'll give you an example, very recent, King's School. I went to King's School to speak to them about town planning. And then the teacher kindly last month sent me an email to say how 3 of them have now gone on to study town planning as a consequence of the talk. you get those little opportunities to make a difference in someone's life because you are the chief. You can do that. You can choose what meetings to take. Anyway, it's interesting that you have that ability to do that.
Yeah. And public service at its best. I've worked in local government for most of my career too, and that sort of sense of that actually you're there serving people. That's what drives you on, doesn't it, when you work in public service? But can you just bring us then a bit more up to date? And I see Michael in the chat also has posted this, and it was a question I was just about to ask actually. Can you just tell us about what brought you to Devon? Because actually before you were at Exeter City, you were working in East Devon. Can you tell us kind of how you landed in this part of the world, Karime, and what it was like when you kind of arrived in a sort of more senior leadership role?
Yeah, so I was dealing at the time in South Wales in Newport. There was a project, it was LG, which is the Korean semiconductor manufacturer. And I had worked on what was there, which is the biggest investment in Western Europe at the time, 1.7 billion in investment. And I was managing that project. And then I was thinking, I was the development manager, and I was looking for a career opportunity to become a head of service. And this opened up in Exeter, a head of service opportunity. And they were looking for someone to manage the biggest project that the council was dealing with, which is Princess Hay. And so they liked that management skill of project management. And I remember coming down, it was one of those things. It's a beautiful city. It's a beautiful city. You go for a walk and you see the cathedral, see the quayside. And actually, I fell in love with the place. So as an aside, right, the reason why Exeter, I went to a planning summer school at Exeter, and I remember getting locked in the library, right? That was my experience. I went to the library and I was reading, and I got so engrossed in reading, I didn't realize that they locked the library. And then I was literally locked in. I was banging the window to let me out. That was my first experience of Exeter. So it was in my head. It was a lovely place. And then I came, and I never looked back. It was a labor of love, really. I've never looked back.
That's so interesting. And can you say a bit more then about your sort of cultural identity, I suppose, in a sense? So you're very evidently a Welshman. I think you were saying to me the other day, you're one of the few Muslim leaders, one of very few people of colour leading local authorities in the Southwest. Can you kind of tell us more about how your cultural identity has shaped the kind of leader that you are?
Yeah. So I think we have lots of identities, don't we? That's I think Bob Dylan sings a song about it.
Good day to mention Bob Dylan.
I am multitudes, yeah, but yeah, I am multitudes. I think his song. And so my father, so my grandfather is Arab Yemen. My father was passionately Welsh as a reaction to his experience when he was sent back to Yemen at 15, and it wasn't a good experience for him. So he went straight into the army. He's a proud Welshman, would stand up when the Queen was on, typical kind of military man. For me, I've always seen that richness of both being Welsh, British, and also Arab and Muslim. And I love meeting cultures and identity. I'm not a fan of tribalism and nationalism. I just think we benefit more from each other than sort of box us into these identities. But what it does mean is there's a lot of things going on in terms of our identities, and some people are misguided. They've gone in wrong directions. You've seen that, the troubles we've had over the last decade or so. And I've always wondered. I'm a CEO. I don't know many local authority chief execs who are Muslim. Very rarely had a conversation with anybody for any insights as to the kind of challenges that they face. But it's certainly there are things I can talk about, things I can't talk about. Yeah. So I've been racially abused in terms of the house being attacked and threats and all kinds of things. It's not pleasant. So I can relate to people who experience racial discrimination. I know what it's like when you apply, you don't know whether you're going to be rejected just because your name is on, which is why you can make a big difference just by saying something very simple, which is we would welcome applications from people of Northern Ireland background. Actually, that was our case here with Exeter. I literally there was a very clear statement. I thought, oh, that's fine. Things have changed though, Ciara. The things that I experienced in the 80s was disgusting.
Yeah.
Both in terms of the sexism and racism, and that's completely transformed in the public institutions now. It's completely different era.
Yeah. I think you were telling me the other day that when you came for your interview in Exeter, it was during Ramadan, wasn't it?
Yeah. Chester Long, he was a leader of the council. He was awesome. But I was fasting, and I was worried about, because it was a working lunch interview, and I thought, oh God, I'm going to tell him. And Chester is a real character. But it was a test. It was difficult. But I got the job, so it did work out.
It did work out, yeah. But really, I mean, really shocking still to hear those stories, though, Karime, that your experience and just in terms of Devon and Exeter, what more can we all do as leaders then to support a much more diverse, inclusive environment for us all to live and work in? Because we've all got a part to play. The university has its part, the city council has a part, we as individuals. What more can we all do you think?
Yeah, we can always do more, Ciara, and I think the challenge is so when I look back to the day, I mean, I was appointed to do that job in Derby, and I think of my time in Derby and in Nottingham. This was the 80s. The reality was there was political pressure. So those communities, and there were sizable populations in those areas demanding things to be done. And sometimes there's a natural, when you've got a large number of people asking. I'll give you an example. In those days, I was working with the community around things like halal meat for those in the hospital and health service, because it was a particular challenge, or translation services. So there's always things that can be done. And there's a kind of a very deliberate intervention that one needs to make. And I think back to, you just think now in a different context, but we've been a city that's been growing constantly over the 2 decades. And yet we still know there are communities in the city that haven't benefited from the growth. We still go to our neighborhoods. And that's why our members have got a little bit impatient with, we need to do more about how we engage with our communities to make sure that they have the opportunities that everybody is having. So it isn't the case that all boats rise on a rising tide. We do need to do something different.
Yeah, well, we'll come to that in a few minutes, because I'll ask you about sort of inclusive growth and low carbon, all of those things that you're passionate about. But just to finish off this piece, then looking back over your career, Karime, and thinking about those sort of 30 plus years of being in leadership roles, can you identify for us 1 or 2 key moments in your career when things have just shifted and changed for you as a leader, and what was at the root of those kind of shifts that you made?
Okay. I would say if we put down a marker when we had austerity, so what we saw was, well, I suppose it was that change in government between the Labour government of Blair, Gordon Brown, and then the Cameron Osborne government. What we saw across the public sector was a massive change, I think. So before Cameron Osborne, you had, I would describe as leadership and management by audit, the audit commission effectively, because what they did is they set these targets and it drove the way we delivered public services. And then post that, with Cameron Osborne, with austerity, we had a sense that we no longer had the funding. So this was no longer about managing your budgets more efficiently. You had to do something different. And it for me was profound, because I had to find a different way of addressing our challenges. Now, in fairness, I think that approach drove a lot more innovation and forced me as a leader to start working more with with others, how we support the voluntary sector, how we support business. So I would say, I think my leadership capabilities absolutely transformed with that kind of austerity era and the need to find new ways of achieving outcomes, shared outcomes.
Yeah. And how did you support your team at that time then to make that sort of shift? Because it's one thing to do it in your own head. How did you kind of take other people with you?
So I would say I think leadership is a really important point here. Right? Leadership can be a bit like, if you're not careful, when you have entertainment, things wash over you, yeah, as opposed to having something that really sticks as part of your makeup. So it's not just an interesting idea, it's part of you, your being. And there are certain techniques that I use, which I've continued to go back to in order to kind of shape, and I do this now with my current leader. So the concept of what's complex and what's complicated, how managing the complex issues is not like writing a rule book for making an airplane. You're dealing with human beings, quite different. Or certainty and uncertainty, or the graph of grief.
Mm.
But the reason I say that is because right at that beginning of austerity, I needed to talk to managers, and I put them all together to say, look, guys and ladies, we have some big decisions. The first decision is this: what's our purpose? Why are we here as a council? Is it to deliver services? And therefore, when we need to find ways of doing things differently, we go back to basic statutory and non-statutory? Or is it about the clarity of vision that says, and at that time, the vision for Exeter was to enhance Exeter as a regional capital, working with our partners to improve the quality of life for those who visit, live, and work here. Because if that's the case, when we need to look at the funding issues, you aren't going to go to a statutory discretionary split, because culture matters, voluntary sector matters. So for me, the first thing I had to do with my managers is to say, we need to be clear on this, because we ain't going to solve the problem by just going back to basic statutory services and then see the city go backwards. Yeah. So what you've got to do, you've got to work harder as leaders to protect the funding that goes into culture and the voluntary sector, but do things differently. So it's no longer about managing budgets better. We got to find a different way of doing the business, and therefore we needed to do something different. Now, for me, that was embracing systems thinking, bringing in systems thinking. Vanguard was a consultant at the time, but it was to really drill into what is the purpose, why are we here? That Simon Sinek type of approach. So that was the issue, and then really working and constantly with the managers through what is really challenging times. And not all the managers, stayed the course. A lot of managers went.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you about that in terms of, the past year, as you've said, it's been very tough. Those 10 years of austerity also tough in different ways. How do you keep yourself going when things are really tough? I mean, you're such a positive person, and I've never seen you kind of down, but everybody has times when you just think, I can't do more. What sustains you? What keeps you going as a leader?
I've given you some insights of my background, and I know we make a difference. I know we make a difference to people's life in a very tangible way. So that's really important to me. But I've always had a philosophy that says you have to have an agenda and you have to have a plan. And every day you wake up, you've got an agenda. And the difference between places that I think that are successful is that you have real focus on where you want to go. Because if you do that, like these shocks, no problem. So I've always felt that Exeter should be one of the most successful places in the UK. Absolutely. No reason why we shouldn't. And that we've got the opportunity to be to grow our institutions like the Met Office University so that they are even more successful and that they make a contribution to the city greater than they perhaps have done. So if you've got a 20-year plan, then the fact that you are knocked off course every now and again is to be expected. The difference is you are either going to be more resilient because the plan you've had has assumed you're going to get these shocks. And therefore, because of that, you've been doing the right things. I'll give you an example. We were working on the new redevelopment of what we call the bus and coach station site for the last decade. And the conversations that I would have had with the leader when the finances were looking difficult was along this. This is the message. This is what I would say to him. What's happening to city centres? Retailing is declining. We've got to diversify. We need to create experiences. How do you create experiences? Then you've got to think of it's either going to be culture or it's going to be leisure. It requires big capital investment. If you don't do it now, you will decline. It's very simple. If you don't make some big interventions now, it will decline. And it takes 10 years from the idea to implementation. So whilst it's why it's controversial, why it's contentious, if you don't take this decision now, if anything happens, and I will tell you the truth, I've been telling everybody, we were due for a recession now, this time, because it was a 10-year cycle. And so in fairness to the leader, the politicians, they took the view that, yes, you're right, we're going to keep that flywheel effect going. Yeah. So personally, yeah, I could see there's a problem. I have a lot of challenges. It gets you down at times. God, can you imagine? I dealt with Cranbrook. We had 14,500 objections to Cranbrook. 14,500. It was the biggest objections to any local plan in the country. And what was the argument? It was going to be flooded. We didn't need the houses and so forth. So Steve Smith, the Vice Chancellor of Exeter, used to say to me, you're paid to make big strategic calls, Karime. That's what goes with the territory. And he's right.
Mm. And when you think then, Karime, in terms of the legacy that you want to leave in Exeter, and of course it's a shared legacy because you work in a political environment and you're working with the leader of the council and their political colleagues, and you're working with leaders across the city. But what do you want in your remaining time in Exeter? What legacy do you want to leave in the city ultimately?
It's a great question because I genuinely now, I have the conversation with my politicians around legacy because I've seen leaders come and go when I've worked at the places. They're seldom thanked for the kind of strong leadership they show to deliver the projects. Nobody remembers them. Absolutely, people forget about them. And yet we all benefit from the fact that they took these big decisions that mean that they now have homes over their heads and so forth. So legacy is important. It's often easier with big capital projects because you can at least point and say, I did that. Yeah, I will contribute to that. What's less is the human issues. The less people less remember that. And I had the benefit that before me as a director in Exeter was John Rigby, really tenacious guy. The Met Office wouldn't have come. Princess Edward wouldn't have happened without this tenacious, dogged style of getting things done. Likewise, Philip Bostock, who was the CEO before me, absolutely. Without Philip, I wouldn't have been done. Yeah. And so for me, if people remember I made a contribution to Exeter, that's great. I just think it's one of those things in life. It's like Victorians planted lots of trees and they built railways and we benefit. And someone said once about a man planting an olive tree. Oh man, why are you planting olive tree? Because the people before me planted it and I've enjoyed the fruit of that. And that's our human experience. Yeah. Yeah. People will disappoint you, but you do it because it's the right thing.
And you've taken us to the sort of environmental, because I know that working in the city to make it a kind of low carbon city is an important part of what you do. Could you say a bit more about your aspirations for Exeter in terms of that environmental agenda?
So one of the key things for us has always been, growth has got to be balanced. And if you don't get growth right, then you have all the negative aspects of growth. And one of the things we were clear about some time back was the need for livability to be front and center stage. Really, it's about well-being. Most important aspect of all of us now is well-being. And all organizations will recognize that will be the case. So from a point of view of creating a great place, a great city, taming the car, taming the impact of the car, getting the benefits that come when you can walk and cycle in a pleasant environment. and creating the right mix of uses such that it's attractive and vital and alive. That livability agenda is really critical, and it's absolutely compatible with an environmental agenda that seeks to deal with our carbon emissions. It's complementary. So by addressing carbon, I think it forces us to do the right things in terms of livability. So that's really important. And I think for us, what we have to recognize, why I'm really confident Exeter should be one of the best places in the country when it comes to the future, is we have USP we've got the best world scientists on climate in Exeter. 5 of the top 21 scientists in the world on climate change are resident here in Exeter. Your institute.
Yeah.
So your challenge and my challenge, so having got the world-leading research in university and Met Office, how do we get the commercial application from that to support the economy for the long term?
And what do you think then, how will that manifest itself, do you think, in Exeter over the next 10 years? What should we all expect to be different in Exeter?
So I would say to Ciara, the one challenge Devon has and the whole of the Southwest Peninsula is a lack of innovation and a lack of startup enterprises. And so when you say, how do we capitalize on that research, is we need to have a thriving ecosystem of when businesses can come out of that research, and that is the support infrastructure, the right access to finance, the right angel investors, the right opportunities to collaborate. When you got that happening, and when all the skills agenda is addressed compatible with that, so we've got apprenticeships that are producing the data analysts, when we've got our university professors thinking about how they create the talent, how do they hold the talent in Exeter, those graduates, so they reside in Exeter to power an economy. That will help the wider Southwest, where we are basically outside of Exeter, is aging. We need this. Exeter needs to do this. It needs to be supported to do this. So I'd love us to be the place that if you are anyone interested in green technology, you come to Exeter, because you'll be able to get it off the ground. That's what I'd love to have.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to turn my attention now to a few questions that have come in, Karime, on this theme, actually. And if people have got other questions to ask too, do pop them in the chat. So, and before we finish off, because I'm going to ask you 2 final questions, as you might know, before we finish. But Will from Ride on Cycling for All has said, if Exeter is to achieve its objective of being carbon neutral by 2030, we're going to need our political leaders to continue to take brave, evidence-based decisions, which are not necessarily always perceived as popular, particularly in the areas of housing and transport. How can council officials give political leaders the confidence to make the bold decisions we need?
Yeah, really point well made. So I'll give you an example of that, just to colour that for you. I went with Rachel Sutton, who's the deputy, she's the portfolio holder for Net Zero, and she was then the deputy leader. We went to Ghent with people from the university to have a look at Ghent and what they've done on this agenda. And they basically pedestrianised the city centre, the historic city centre. And they told us that the mayor of the city, their mayor is like our leader of a council, their mayor had to wear a body vest because they had received death threats. Yeah, that's how the petrol heads over there had made that such a big issue. So what that did really, it crystallizes how difficult these issues are, and that's the challenge for us. So I would not in any way make light of the challenge facing them. Now, one of the things I said to you earlier is that when you get these controversial issues, very rarely that the politicians get paid back. They're not, because it takes so long. But you want them to do the right thing. And one of the ways that can be helped is, I remember listening to a chap called Cormac Russell when he gave a masterclass in Exeter. And one of the things he said to us was, you need to provide an umbrella of protection for your politicians. An umbrella of protection. That's what each and every one of the businesses and the community groups can do to give the politicians a little bit of protection and support that they can take some of these bold decisions. And that's all I can do. I keep making the case. I was at the Chamber of Commerce last week. I said the same thing to them. You need to help the politicians by being prepared to do that. The reality is there's a balance because, you still need people from rural areas to get in the city.
Yeah.
But officers need to do the how bit, the what bit is what the politicians need to do.
Yeah. So interesting to hear about Ghent, though, because you just assume that everybody in the Netherlands is kind of up for all of that sort of stuff. So it's so interesting to hear how tough it is in other places as well, isn't it? Question from Kamal, who's one of our MBA students. She says, hi, Karime. It's inspiring and insightful to hear your journey in the public sector. I'm a public sector advisory professional currently pursuing MBA. My question to you is, can students like me work with the Exeter City Council in our capacity to enrich our experience and contribute in improving the lives of people in the city?
Yeah. I've never knowingly said no to any request from the university to support any of the groups. In fact, I love it. I get the vitality from young people and students. It helps. So yeah, if I need to organize something a bit more formal to engage, I will do. The politicians at Exeter from all political parties are absolutely up for these kind of things.
Yeah, well, I think that, Kamal, that's a good offer for you. And I know Jackie Bagnall, who's the director of our MBA, is on the call as well. So we might sort something out after this, Karime, if that's all right. So we've got Kutlu Onda saying, asking a question earlier, how do you measure Exeter in terms of multiculturalism and pluralism?
How do you measure it?
Yeah, so I suppose
so, I think here, if I'm really candid, I think in many respects, there's been significantly more progress in other parts of the country because the sheer weight in percentages of the population that are of a minority ethnic and Black community has demanded that. I mentioned to you in the 80s around the health services having to provide, halal food and stuff like that. So yeah, it's natural that those places like London and others are ahead of the game.
And what's going to put a rocket up all of us then in the southwest, Karime, and in Devon? What is going to make the difference? Otherwise, we're just going to potter on for years and years, aren't we? Being behind the curve.
Yeah. It would be interesting to have the conversation directly with our members, because I think in Exeter, you will probably find a hell of a lot of support for doing things differently. So I think it's the kind of conversation that I would encourage with our politicians to have a look what could be done. And really, one of the things I've always is sometimes is, you can self-censor yourselves at times in terms of expectation until you then have the conversation. You realize, why was I holding back? Because you then engage and people are up for it and embrace it.
Well, I think we've all got to do less self-censoring then by the sound of it and just go for it. Lucy Hartley, who's one of our fellows, asks a question which you touched on earlier, but you might want to say a bit more, is what's your vision for the city centre, especially in the light of more big shops closing?
Well, so this is not, we've been planning this for well over a decade. We're effectively encouraging more residential properties within the city, creating a lot more opportunities for leisure and culture. I think the difference is, Ciara, if I'm honest, I don't think we get enough support financially from national bodies for culture. And I'll give you an example. So Arts Council Southwest, the people who run that, lovely people, great relationship with them, but they've put a whole lot of money into Plymouth, a whole lot of money into Southampton, and a hell of a lot more money into Bristol. And I'd like a bit of that money for a serious entertainment concert hall type facility in the city. And I think we're due for that. I think we've done an awful lot on culture and we've shown our willingness to support the cultural sector, but we do need something. We've had a vision out for the city centre for over a decade, which is about greening the city. And that's about cutting out the through traffic that goes through some of our streets, making more pedestrian-dominated public spaces. So that I think is still consistent where we want to go. Where I think that probably the big difference will be, I think the brands that are in the city are starting to realize, John Lewis in particular, the new CEO of John Lewis, mentioned this on the weekend, they've got to make their stores different to reflect the locality rather than national. And what I think that means for us is, if you look at local provenance of food and products, this city has a very strong attachment to local provenance, which isn't the same as being reflected in the national branding. And I think 4th Street is a great example of a place that on its own steam has reinvented itself. And we've got some great shops down there, environmentally sensitive. That's a very clear pointer to where the future of the city centre needs to be.
Yeah, I totally believe that. Thank you. So we've got a few more minutes left, Karime, and there might be time for one or two more questions coming in on the chat. But I wanted to ask you, though, 2 final questions from me. So one of them is around, because we have MBA students and alumni, everybody always likes a kind of good book recommendation or a good talk that you've listened to. And I know you're always up for coming across inspiring new talks and books and things like that. So what have you read or come across in the last year or so that's really struck you and you would recommend to people on this call?
So if I can, because in terms of leadership, particularly with the public sector in mind, which might be a bit different to the ones who come and speak to you, there are some real kind of foundational stuff which have held good, I think, for a while. So you got your Tom Peters kind of towards our search of excellence type approach, which is fine. And he's always doing good stuff on sort of videos, YouTube and so forth. They're sound bites, but actually they're things you keep working on. But some of the foundational things, one would be Jim Collins' Good to Great, but the one he did on social sciences, it's a very small pamphlet, 40 pages, but I always go back to it. It's really, really solid about level 5 leadership, really very good. Simon Sinek, I think he's in industry in his own right. If you look at YouTube, he's got all kinds of things. But the purpose of why, and I was introduced to his work by Sasha Romanovich.
Yeah, Romanovich, yes.
From Grant Thornton, she's left there now. But it's worth investing in and really has made me rethink a lot of what I do. John Seddon from Vanguard, it's the kind of book, it's less about the reading, more the doing, but absolutely, for me, has fundamentally changed the way I lead. That's been great. A very small pamphlet from the Institute of Local Government Studies, which is based at Birmingham, on 21st century public servant. Really helpful in terms of breaking down the various roles of leaders, the various hats you wear. And I use that constantly. So I keep coming back. All my managers have had that. I've been working with them on that. That's something I come back to. So Michael Barber, How to Run a Government. So Michael Barber just come out with a new book now. One of the things that's happened post-austerity is, I think, we've lost the art of delivering. Real practical, how you get things done. And I think it's quite, he's been brought in by Boris to advise the government on delivery. I think he used to be on the council of the university. His book is a fantastic book. I gave every one of my assistant directors a copy. I bought them all a copy of his book about delivery. So I would say that's another a good read.
We might get him onto a future Leading Edge, maybe, Karime. He sounds great. So.
Oh yeah, no, he's Boris Johnson has brought him in to help sharpen up their act, really.
And then my last question, which I know you're prepared for, because I told you this beforehand, but is this dream dinner party. So you're allowed 4 or 5 people, alive or dead, to come to your dream dinner party. Tell us. So you mentioned Bob Dylan. Of course, it's his 80th birthday today. I don't know if he's. Tell us who's coming to your dinner party.
Well, then. I haven't been so ambitious to get Bob Dylan in. I would tell you, really honest, I would be really happy if I could bring the 4 writers from the Times who write about rugby, Stephen Jones and Stuart Brown. I'd have a lovely dinner on myself with them, right? But I've been given a bit more thought than that. And although climate change is the biggest issue from humanity, I thought, and I really sincerely believe this, it's not about talk anymore, you've got to do. So I don't want to have a dinner about that. The issue for me is about identity politics. And I'm really fascinated what's going on in the States and what's happening in this country, and how, for example, in this country, Labour seats have gone Conservative, Conservative seats have gone Labour. And if you look in the States, what's happened with Trump and how the Christian community, in big swathes have been supporting Trump and what's going on there. There's a few people I would bring together just to understand this issue, because I want to know. And I hate ranting, and I love subtlety and understanding people's view. Right. So the first one, I did have dinner once with Dia Khan. Dia Khan is a filmmaker. She came to give a TEDx talk in Exeter, born in Norway, I think. She's done some work with the extreme right wing in America, made a video called Meeting the Enemy, also with fundamentalist jihadis. She's fabulous. There's another lady writer called from Turkey, Elif Shafak. Yes. She again talks about identity, trying to build bridges and really understanding the other. Now, there's a guy in the States called Eric Matexas. He formed the Socrates in the City program, and he used to be absolutely anti-Trump, Christian radio host, and he'd become a massive fan of Trump, absolutely massive fan of Trump, and he's erudite. He's very thoughtful, right? And I'd be fascinated what's happened, how you change. I'd love to get him in, but I put him in on a dining table with somebody called Hamza Yusuf. Hamza Yusuf is a classically trained scholar of Islam in the States. So he's an American-born, classically trained, and unlike most of the, you get ranting scholars, this guy is very erudite, very thoughtful. And then there's a chap called George the Poet. He's based in London. And when I listen to him, he reminds me of my upbringing and the guys I hang out with, and brings me back down very much, because I get sometimes divorced from everything. He's great. And then my favorite is Chomsky, Noam Chomsky. And that's because I'm a product of the 70s and 80s, and ideology was really a big deal. And the one thing is, sometimes you need the length of, you can be caught up in the moment. Sometimes you need a bit of distance and perspective. But I think in terms of our identity and the struggle, I think that would be very helpful.
What a brilliant selection, Karime. Funnily enough, I do actually know George the Poet, not that I'm showing off.
Right.
We both sit on the board of Arts Council England. So, and in fact, we've been talking about getting him to come and do something at the business school. So maybe you've just prompted us to
Brilliant.
get him along. But that's a super, super list of people, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. James Anthony Edwards, who's the university librarian, has reminded us, and of course I'd forgotten this, that Sir Michael Barber is in conversation tonight with the Vice-Chancellor. And there are tickets available. I don't know if you knew that, Karime.
I didn't know. No, right, brilliant.
So I'll send you the link so you've got that, so you can.
You're in for a treat, Ciara. You're in for a treat tonight.
Sounds brilliant. But thank you so much, Karime. You've been so honest and open and warm and generous with both your time and your insights, and we really appreciate it. So thank you. I didn't get to ask all of the questions that people ask, but I know that you're the kind of person that's around and always happy to have a chat with people. So thank you so much. Just a reminder that our final fireside chat in this series is next month. It's on the 10th of June with Tonya Nelson, who's the Director of Arts Council in London. So do join us if you can. Do sign up. And we are starting to plan, as I think I mentioned, our autumn series of leading edge talks. So talk is thinking about the big challenges facing our world, and Jackie Bagnall and I are starting to plan that session at the moment. So if you've got ideas for speakers that you'd like to hear as part of the Leading Edge talk, then do drop me an email or contact Jackie or I. But thank you all for joining us. Karime, thanks again for joining us today, and thanks for everybody for coming to our Leading Edge.
Bye-bye.